Okay, we have quite a lot of content, so I'll get started. And if more people join while we started, that is fine. You can normally navigate between slides from your end as well, so don't hesitate to do that. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, first some housekeeping and introductions of the speaker of the day. Then we'll give you an overview of local government reorganisation and then diving into what LGR might mean for future service delivery options for your waste services, what that might mean for live contracts, and finally we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So some housekeeping, these slides and the recording will be circulated to all attendees after the webinar. And during the webinar, don't wait until the end section, which is the Q&A, to pop your questions. So at the top, you'll have a section that you can see called Q&A. So if you go in there, you can pop your questions as we go through the webinar. If you like one of the questions that someone else asked, you can like it, and then it moves it to the top and gives it more chance of being picked up at the end. We're aiming to have about 10 minutes at the end to go through the questions, but if we run out of time to go through all of them, we'll send also answers in writing afterwards. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Sharpe Pritchard and Eunomia, so I'll hand over to Julie for Sharpe Pritchard.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Julie Lau. I'm a partner at Sharpe Pritchard, and today I am joined by my colleague Natasha Barlow, an associate in our team. We're both in the infrastructure team here at Sharpe Pritchard. Sharpe Pritchard's is a law firm known for its public sector expertise, and our team regularly advises on complex, high-value procurements, including PPP and PFI arrangements. Natasha and I have, together with others in our team, led major waste procurements for district, unitary, and London borough councils, and we advise on procurement and contract strategy. We also advise on inter-authority arrangements, which obviously is quite pertinent to the topic we're talking about today. We have also been working with clients specifically to navigate the impact of LGR and on their current and upcoming waste contracts. We work alongside other teams in our firm, other specialist teams who provide things like advice on things like property, planning law, employment law, overarching public law matters as well. And so we work together with the other teams to advise clients on the delivery of their waste contracts.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julie. So now a little bit about Eunomia. So Eunomia is a global sustainability consultancy. We help organizations design systems that are more sustainable in a practical and deliverable way. So our work is centered around three key themes that you can see in the middle of the screen here: circular economy, low carbon economy, and natural economy. We help organizations move away from linear, high carbon systems towards solutions that minimize waste, reduce emissions, and work in balance with natural system. Now, if I bring that a bit closer to today's webinar, our implementation team works with local authorities across the UK at every stage of their waste journey, from service efficiency reviews, waste collection options, through to assessing future service models, and importantly, supporting implementation of the chosen approach, including reprocurement support. And briefly on who you'll be hearing from today, my colleague Emma Tilbrook, our head of implementation, has over 16 years experience working with local authority and leads Eunomia's most complex project, particularly in service commissioning, procurement, infrastructure, and service transitions. And I am Manon Bataille, a principal consultant at Eunomia. I work as a project director and technical lead across a range of waste management projects, and I lead our specialist waste and public sector procurement team. Okay, moving on to an overview of LGR. So first, to get started with that section, we'll launch a poll. So you should see this appearing on your screen. This is simply to understand a little bit where everyone's joining the webinar is coming from in terms of the council they work for, or that may be the council you live in. Whether that council you think they are being affected by LGR, and if you already know what the structure will look like, or you don't know yet, or LGR has no impact on your council, or you're not sure. So yeah, take a few seconds to look at the different options, put your vote in, and then I'm going to have a look at the results. Let's give it a few more. Already got 70 responses. It's great. So there's a clear winner already, which is that for most people attending the webinar, your council will change you to LGR, but you do not yet know what the new structure will look like. So it shows, how much uncertainty there is still around LGR, and I think this webinar will be very interesting to you, and yeah, we'll keep that in mind when going through the rest of the content. Brilliant, thank you. Moving on to what is LGR, and I'm handing over to Natasha.
Thanks, Manon. So turning first to what LGR actually is. So in a broad sense, local government reorganisation is the process in which the structure and responsibilities of local authorities are reconfigured. So as I'm sure most of you will be aware, looking at the poll, on the 5th of February 2025, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government issued a statutory invitation under Part 1 of the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007 to all two-tier local authorities and any small neighbouring unitary authorities in England to develop proposals for forming unitary authorities. And the requirement is that all of those two-tier and smaller unitaries develop proposals to reorganise into larger unitary authorities. And the intention is that for each of those unitary authorities, the population will be 500,000 or more. So the government first, in its kind of first wave of LGR, has identified Cumbria, Surrey, Hampshire, Essex, Kent and Sussex as the first areas, and then further areas will be to follow. And I think it's quite interesting, there are 21 remaining county councils in England, and within that there's 164 district councils. So there are, after those first 6 that have been identified, there are a lot more to come. So we will continue to see this for the next couple of years in particular. So where a proposal is to be implemented, elections will generally take place in May 2027. And the expectation is that new unitary councils will take on their full council roles from April 2028. And so generally there'll be transitional arrangements in place between those 2 dates. There are, of course, exceptions. So notably Surrey County Council and its districts are moving at a faster pace. So the 2 unitary authorities, East Surrey and West Surrey, are due to take over in April 2027, and they're currently in the transition phase with the shadow authorities. It's, I think, quite helpful to note that LGR is separate from the creation of the strategic authorities, which I'm sure everyone will also have heard about under the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act, which will be looking to bring together a number of councils across large regional areas, but both kind of play into the government's intention of bringing power to local areas. Next slide, please. So looking at a timeline, this slide shows the key steps for LGR. And this timeline starts on the 5th of February 2025 for all authorities, which is, as we've said, when the government invited proposals. Step 2 is the submission of formal unitary proposals, which happened between May and November last year, and all of the council areas did submit proposals. Step 3 is statutory consultations, which are currently being undertaken with each of the affected councils, and that will happen before any proposals are implemented to allow those councils to comment on them. Step 4 is the decision to implement a proposal for each of the council areas, either with or without modification. And if there is any modification proposed by government, then that requires further consultation. So, for example, East Sussex and Brighton and Hove have recently been subject to a further consultation following an amended proposal. And once a proposal is then decided, then secondary legislation will be introduced to enact it. And this takes the form of a structural changes order, which will specify, firstly, that the existing councils are being dissolved, it will set out the functions and governance arrangements of the new council both in the transition period and beyond, and the electoral arrangements for the new unitaries as well. And that's then followed by a transition period. And that's when the new councils will be elected and they'll form the shadow authorities. And during that time, the outgoing authorities continue to administer their usual functions and services until vesting day, which is the final stage. And that's when the new unitary authority officially goes live. So that's set to be 1st of April 2027 for Surrey and 1st of April 2028 for other authorities. And that's then the final stage. Handing back over to you, Manon, I think.
Thank you, Natasha. Yeah, this is just an example to show you kind of in practical terms what the LGR can look like in one of the area already decided. So this is Hampshire, Isle of Wight, where the new unitaries have already been announced. We have here Isle of Wight left unchanged, but then 4 new authorities, 4 new unitary authorities being created. What's interesting in this example is that LGR is not only merging current district council, so you can see that for North Hampshire Council, that is merging Basingstoke, Stoke, Dean, Hart and Rushmore, using the current boundaries of these district councils. But for the other 3 unitary councils, you actually have 11 parishes from East Hampshire, New Forest, Test Valley and Winchester that are excluded from their current district council. So they won't join Mid Hampshire councils like these district councils, but they will join 2 other unitary authorities, so South East Hampshire or South West Hampshire. So that just adds a degree of complexity as well. And interesting to note that the same approach as Hampshire has been followed for Norfolk and Suffolk, who are already been announced as well. And both will be splitting into 3 new unitaries with new boundaries and parishes being redistributed. And then other examples like Surrey, which will be divided in 2 new unitaries, as Natasha touched on. And for this one, the whole current district council have been kind of kept as they were, so with no redistribution of parishes. And it's the same for Essex, Southern-on-Sea and Thurrock, which are divided in 5 new unitaries with no redistribution of parishes. So yeah, just interesting to see what the ones that have been announced look like, and this kind of added level of complexity with breaking down the current boundaries of district councils. I'm now going to hand over to Julie, I think, for the first part of this slide.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the first things to grapple with really is overlaying the LGR decision timeline. So along the lines of what Natasha spoke to earlier, and obviously the specific detailed timelines will be different for depending on which batch of authorities you're in. But one of the first things to grapple with is overlaying that as against the actual service needs. So we're talking here about waste contracts today. So at the end of the day, there are statutory services that need to be carried out. What are the needs there? What are the existing arrangements and contracts or in-house services that are being provided, and what are the ones that will need to continue to be provided regardless, until and unless the authority falls away and something takes its place. So the first thing to understand, I think, is how that wider LGR timeline for your authority matches or kind of overlays your own critical paths and milestones in the services needs. So for example, as I mentioned, if some of your statutory services, for example waste collection, are being carried out by an outsourced contract, then it's knowing when that expires, knowing if there's any ability to extend those contracts, consider what it will take to use them, what do you need by way of authority or other parts of the contract that you might need to kind of trigger or meet in order to use those, and then understanding any key milestones within the more detailed LGR transition timeline. Once you have that information about the transition timeline, any potential vesting dates, just understanding and matching up where those dates cross against your service need. And I think really it's about considering also then, once you have a clearer idea of which picture you're looking at. So Manon talked to us about all the different permutations of reorganisation. Could be breaking up, could be joining up, all of those. Once you have a clearer understanding of which proposal is likely to take place for your area, then it's understanding the terms of the boundaries and the particular councils that will be coming into play. Start thinking about what the likely impact might be of decisions that you make now, for example, whether or not to extend a contract or how long you might, do a contract for. Starting to think a little bit about the impact of those decisions that you currently take as your authority and how that could impact a successor or shadow authority. Obviously, that will require a bit of due diligence and potentially also just communication, talking to neighbours, talking to other relevant authorities that you might be grouping up with or who you will have close interactions with over this period, to understand how their services are being delivered and what their critical timelines are too. And of course, this will then largely depend on the type of waste service you have and how you're kind of delivering them at the moment. And on that note, I will hand over to Emma to talk us through different types of waste services.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, I think really on that different impact for different service types point, there's kind of a number of people during the call today, some of you from disposal authorities and some of you for collection authorities. So the way kind of we're seeing this playing through is actually that impact will be different depending on kind of where you're coming from. For a disposal authority that's looking after kind of HWRC, disposal contracts, etc., it's likely, depending on where the decisions on LGR go, that actually it's going to be breaking some of those kind of areas up. So previously one authority could become 2, 3 authorities in the future. That actually looks and feels quite different to if you sat in a collection authority where potentially you're joining with other collection authorities, potentially with different service types, different commissioning options, and even more complex than that, where you're a collection authority that is then being broken into 2 or 3 new authorities. So really, in terms of that impact of LGR, what we're seeing coming through in some of the work we're doing is actually, what does that mean for me? How does that look and feel for my future? And how do I plan for that? Especially where we're seeing collection authorities being broken kind of by parish lines, that becomes even more complicated depending on kind of the prevalent way of commissioning those services within the authority that they're joining. Now, one of the big kind of pushes behind LGR and one of the kind of big hopes for it is around efficiency, gaining that efficiency through larger scale services, being able to join services together. Now, the first step of that is really understanding and mapping that service data. So actually, where does it make sense to join up things? Where actually can they stay relatively for a little while, at least how they are? And what is that opportunity to review and align services, and what is the timeline for that? One thing LGR doesn't do is preclude 2 authorities from different effectively new unitaries working together where that makes sense. Any kind of 2 legacy authorities, it doesn't preclude that. But I think one of the pieces of the puzzle that we're still working through as the new unitaries are announced is actually, where do I go? Do you know what? That was a disposal authority with, say, an HWRC contract. It's now potentially 2, 3 unitary authorities. Actually, does that make sense for those 3 unitaries to carry on working together? It actually completely may do. Or actually, where does it make sense for us collection authorities to do something different? So that's the piece that, as we start to unravel this kind of LGR decision-making process, when we're thinking specifically about waste services and the associated parts of that puzzle, how does that go together? And I don't think we're seeing that as a one-size-fits-all approach. Next slide, please. So just delving into that efficiency piece in a little bit more detail. When we think about LGR and efficiency, what do we need to consider? So I think for me, the first piece that we're really kind of thinking about is the market. So especially where you are currently outsourced, or whether part of the unitary you're joining or being separated into does have outsourced arrangements. That can't be ignored. And actually the market has a real role to play in this, in kind of joining this puzzle together. So what is the market telling you about your services? What's their view on risk, procurement timings, etc.? Because what we're seeing is the most perfectly designed procurement process, which works fantastically in theory, if we don't understand the markets we're playing into, and actually how does LGR impact them, and how do they mitigate the additional risks that's potentially looking like through that process. Where an authority is looking to reprocure, that needs to be really, really carefully managed. So I think where a kind of an authority is either breaking apart or we've got people joining together, understanding and listening and engaging with the market is going to be absolutely key to that decision-making process. And also it kind of almost goes without saying, but understanding the service and existing contract arrangements. So actually, where are the pinch points? Where does my contract end the day after vesting day with no possible extension to it legally? What do I do in that environment? Versus actually, what could quite easily be solved and is not necessarily a day 1, day 2, day 3, even year 1, year 2 problem? What can we kind of carry on through that legacy process, letting the rest of all those massive amounts of changes which are happening, because they're happening way beyond the realm of waste, where can we hold those until we understand more about how that plays through? So really mapping through those to highlight the areas where kind of the biggest consideration needs to be. And also what's right for the service you're reviewing. I think there is a real push sometimes, and what we see in a lot of the work we do is to make things bigger. So we'll combine these 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things together into a massive contract. Leading back to that market point, it doesn't always mean it's better. We think about, say, reprocessing contracts. Depending on what the market looks like, actually a massive reprocessing contract for, say, DMR might look really different to the market or might play different in the market to potentially smaller DMR processing contracts, depending on the infrastructure which is surrounding you. So it's just a little bit of a word of kind of warning and thinking about when we're thinking about what this looks like in the future is bigger isn't always better and doesn't always mean cheaper. It may actually restrict any markets you're playing into and looking to enter. And then really reviewing those interactions with other key decision-making points. So we think about disposal contracts, we think about collection contracts, HWRC, reprocessing, all of the work that kind of we do to support the statutory waste services. But actually, we've got to buy vehicles, we've got depot leases, we've got infrastructure everywhere. So actually, as much as we can look at this through kind of a very service-driven lens with that real resident focus, which is absolutely essential because ultimately that's what councils are there to do, there are all these other really large capital decisions which sit around that. And actually, is there room there in terms of how do all the decision-making processes flow through? And actually, is that timing working for you as an authority for, I've got vehicles coming to the end of their natural, they're fully depreciated, I need to change them, is now the right time to swap? Do we hold? That's where we're seeing some councils kind of really battling with kind of how do I play through my kind of capital, my depots, my leases, all of the rest of that piece, along with that service delivery model, when I don't know exactly what I look like in the future and kind of who's buying what effectively. And then a real focus on that short, medium and long-term plan. So we probably all know this on this call, but substantial efficiency gains are really unlikely to be realised on day 1 or frankly even year 1 in many cases. So in terms of that mapping out, how do we get to the point of what does efficiency look like for me in my new world post kind of LGR? It's about having that kind of short, medium and long-term plan. And actually for a lot of us, it's going to move more to that medium and long-term place. Flip now, Manon. So we just have a little bit of thought about LGR considerations, kind of future service delivery options, kind of moving more into that commissioning piece. So I think kind of at Eunomia, we do a lot of work on kind of commissioning options appraisals. The bit before we actually do procurement or bring something in-house or make a LATCO, like what do I do? So what's on that screen now is kind of the 3 main options that we look at. So the outsourced joint venture sort of piece, an in-house optional LATCO. That's massively oversimplifying all the options. But in a lot of the work we're doing, we're actually seeing short and long-term versions of these. Do we have interim arrangements followed by longer arrangements, and also hybridizing these? So are my streets in but my waste out, my grounds maintenance doing something else? It's not uncommon to see massive hybrid models behind this, and we are actually seeing more and more of that when we start playing LGR through, because nothing is as simple as it once was. But in terms of those commissioning options appraisals and kind of how we're seeing them play through that LGR context, it's sort of with that outsourced joint venture model and think about how that plays through. Some of the uncertainty and change risks with LGR can be mitigated via kind of break clauses and change notifications and other methods when procuring or re-procuring contracts. And the team from Sharpe's are going to come on to that in a little bit more detail from the legal side in a second. When we're thinking about how in-house options might work, where potentially we're bringing together legacy authorities or breaking authority apart, it's actually quite complex in terms of how this locks in cost liability for kind of staffing costs ultimately, and actually what does that GP transfer process look like, and really trying to understand what that financial liability is. It's not uncommon when we look at kind of especially outsourced contracts which have been outsourced for quite a long time to have 13, 14, 15 sets of legacy terms and conditions running through those, then trying to play that through an in-house context and what does that mean, really trying to get to grips with what that liability is really complicated. It's not insurmountable, but I would say with that in-house option, once that's been locked in and a service has been bought in-house, you're not going to recover any of those changes to kind of people costs after that. And sort of the role of a local authority trading company or something along those lines, kind of a LATCO, LGR is actually likely to bring quite a lot of changes in terms of LATCO governance arrangements, depending on how the LATCO is currently governed and what that looks like under an LGR model in the future. That definitely doesn't preclude that as an option. It could be a really excellent option for local authority. It just needs to be played through quite carefully, I think, in terms of who has control, how does that control, and how does that work, especially where a LATCO is currently governed or owned by one existing, let's say, collection authority. How does that play through, and that has different owners in the future? And it's definitely something that we're seeing more and more interest in as sort of an interim or a movable option. So I'm handing over to Julie.
Thanks, Emma. Right, so now we're going to be thinking about specifically about reletting and obviously in the context of where you've got an outsourcing program already and you are particularly in the midst of or about to relet current already outsourced or contracts that you've already made a plan to outsource. So what do you do now while there are various things hanging in the balance, while you may not even be entirely sure, as many of you have said, what the outcome of LGR is going to specifically look like for you? You might have some ideas. Usually you've got a couple of through the proposals put through, you'll have a few under consultation, you'll have a few options. But we're seeing a lot of clients having to kind of proceed with planned procurements, for example, because there is a statutory need for the services to continue and there's no chance to just wait and see what happens with LGR. So what is that balancing act? What does that look like? I think first you need to bear in mind, and I'm sure you're all very aware of it, but legitimately there are a few things that you're trying to do and balance when you enter the space. You've got the fact that many of you will be a waste authority of some kind. So you've got waste authority duties, be it collection or disposal or both under the Environment Protection Act, and that service has to be delivered regardless. As many of you will be aware of as well, there have been a whole host of changes in environmental legislation and policy as well under things like simpler recycling and other changes under the Environment Act 2021. So you'll be needing to comply with those as well, and bidders and the market are very alive and aware of aware of all those changes and some of the uncertainty in terms of operationally and commercially what that means for them. So you're balancing those as well, which were already having to be balanced when entering into procurement and commercial negotiations prior to LGR being introduced. And also, of course, as a public body, you're thinking about value for money duties and ensuring that you're getting the best value for your contract and for your council. And in fact, with LGR, there's also a consideration underlying all of that you're thinking about value while you're still mainly focusing on procuring for your authority. There is that knowledge that at the end of the day, the new authority who might be taking over the contract you're currently procuring may be a different entity altogether. So having that at the back of your minds as well when making the decision is important. And actually having the kind of overall general public law decision-making considerations around rationality, making a legitimate decision, making something that having a clear and robust audit trail for why you're choosing certain routes in your reletting process. All of that's really important. So those are some of the things I think you need to consider and have in mind when going out to procure, and ensuring that you've got clear reasoning behind decisions you're taking and in light of those things you're balancing. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So some further detailed specific considerations you can think about introducing into your procurement, or which you'll have to think about. So in preparing the base commercial positions for a relet, particularly where LGR hasn't fully taken effect yet, these are some of the things we have been helping clients to navigate and which we think are important to think about. And we've touched on them very briefly earlier as well, but one of the things would be contract length. So it may be that, and all of this is very much, of course, I will say this, but a sort of case by case, because it really does depend on your particular potential makeup for your authority. But it may make sense to have, for example, a shorter contract period than you might have previously done to allow for a sooner alignment of your contract with, say, a neighbouring authority's contract who's also going to be coming, where you're going to be merging, for instance. So if they've got a similarly outsourced contract for, say, collection purposes, you know, is there some benefit in ensuring that your contract somewhat dovetails with theirs from a timing perspective? Now, of course, with all these things, you've got other things to balance against. So is that something that will be commercially palatable to the market? If you were going for a short contract, often it isn't. So having to think about that too, whether at the end of the day, it would be better value for money to proceed with a slightly longer term contract, because actually the last thing you want to do as well is enter into a short term but very expensive contract that wouldn't also make sense from a public law decision making perspective for your successor authority. So again, it's coming back to that balancing of trying to find that right happy middle, I suppose. Another thing you might think of, similar lines really, is almost the reverse of a shorter contract. It is a break clause. So, you know, would you want to go into a contract with the length that you'd normally expect to, but do you want to think about introducing a break clause for the same reason as you might want a shorter contract? But again, same things to balance there. Bidders may not be happy about that. You may have them, maybe some give or take as well. If you want to have the flexibility of breaking your contract early, you might have to give in on other parts of the negotiation. So is that commercially the best decision for your authority? That's something to think about. The use of lots is always something in any case under the Procurement Act. That's another new duty that authorities need to consider as well. But under the Procurement Act, you always have to consider if lots would be suitable for your particular services in any case. So having a think about that to see whether that could help as well, bearing in mind what other services are being procured around you in your neighbouring authorities. And a couple of other things we've considered in the context of LGR and how to sort of future-proof procurements while you're going on without that further knowledge of LGR is to think about using permitted modification grounds. Again, under the Procurement Act 2023, there are a couple of grounds that may well be helpful for LGR purposes, where you can build in a little bit of future-proofing so that a few years down the line, when LGR does actually take effect and a new authority has been vested, then could you use some of those grounds then to amend and vary your contract to allow for those changes and to allow for some sort of rationalization and kind of bringing together different authorities and the different needs they have, for example. So one of those grounds could be using the known risk ground in the Procurement Act, where they're in Schedule 8 of the Act, where there's a ground referred to as a known risk. In other words, something where the authority considered it could jeopardise satisfactory performance of the contract, but because of its nature could not be addressed fully in the contract as awarded. So LGR seems to us like something that would tick that box on the face of it anyway, does seem to meet that requirement. So then it's a case of, if you want to use that as a potential ground later on to make modifications to your contract, and I'm not saying that this is going to be the sort of free, that it'll definitely work every time. It really depends on what those changes are going to be later on. But if you want to be able to use that known risk ground to lawfully modify your contract, you'll need to have described it in the tender notice when you go out to procure. And you need to specifically reference the fact that you might use this known risk ground. So that's something to think about when drafting your tender notice and your procurement documents. And of course, it'd be helpful for bidders to understand at least a little bit about what that LGR situation looks like for you. So it's providing that detail, but of course being very clear and upfront that the whole point of including it as a known risk is that you're not 100% or you're not really certain about what that will look like completely. A second similar ground to consider using is the use of something like an anticipated change mechanism. Might be called different things, but effectively drafting into your contract. And if you can, and particularly if you have a clearer understanding of what your LGR eventual picture might look like, or at least what are some of the services you might need to vary into, out of, or just vary in your contract, is thinking about introducing a detailed change mechanism where you can explain what those changes might look like and how you want them scoped, how you want them delivered, so that you can receive some commercial terms and bidbacks already at the outset about that. So that is quite different from the known risk ground. It is effectively using the ground in the Procurement Act that allows you to make variations, provided that you've been clear about the potential changes in your contract documents. So that using that, you will need to have a little bit more of an understanding about what that potential variation might be. But just a couple of grounds on which you might want to consider building in that flexibility for LGR later on. A final point on this slide is just around defining the sort of scope, the actual physical geographical scope of your contract as well. So particularly where your service is defined by geographical boundaries, just a kind of flag to be very clear about where those lines are drawn physically on a map, and how you want to define that, so that bidders now have that certainty, and they will want the certainty of knowing where they're delivering the services to, and just ensuring that your contract, if you have, for example, any exclusivity clauses, that they are defined carefully and to the boundaries as everybody understands them and knows them as well. I think I'm handing over to is it to Nanon or to Emma?
I think this is still usually.
Is it still me? Okay, I think I've generally covered the slide in any case, but
Brilliant.
I think I'll just very quickly say that, yeah, it's kind of bearing in mind that balancing act again around the fact that some things you might want and the flexibility you might want is not quite potentially something that the market will be happy with. So always remembering that, and then, as I say, balancing against your all the very many hats you wear and all the other duties you have. But yeah, I'll hand over on this note.
Brilliant. I think that's going over to Natasha.
Thank you. So turning then to the considerations for a live contract, and we'll look first at the legal considerations. So because LGR involves the transfer of functions between authorities, this of course comes with the transfer of services, contracts, assets and liabilities, among many other things. So in the lead up to LGR, as Emma's already mentioned as well, what we'd suggest is that councils ensure that they conduct a detailed review of their contract portfolios, so that you can really understand what changes might be required across the scope of your contracts, and conduct a due diligence exercise on particularly any rights and liabilities that you're inheriting. It will also be really helpful to review the change mechanisms in the contracts, so that you can understand how changes can be introduced, and then that will also obviously come into what changes you want to make and how you do that in an operational sense. So as a starting point, all contracts will need to be novated from the outgoing council to the incoming authorities, and there will be usually a statutory novation, meaning that all contracts will be essentially deemed to be novated to the new authorities, but it will also be best practice to enter into novation agreements as well to reflect the transfer, and you might wrap that up as part of a host of changes that you're looking at across your contract portfolio. So the transfer of some functions and their related contracts might be relatively simple. So if, for example, you have a disposal contract which already sits at county level and aligns with unitary boundaries, then that will be hopefully fairly simple. But obviously a lot of the time that absolutely won't be the case, and there'll often be a potential overlap or duplication of functions between different contracts, where they've come either to be joined up or separated across district and other councils. So, as an example, unitary authorities will likely inherit multiple waste collection and street cleansing contracts. And the likelihood is that those will be on different contract terms, with different providers, and with different assets and liabilities and potentially staffing structures. So a really important job that particularly contract management teams can be involved in will be to understand the differences between those various contracts where they're similar. And it might be that the eventual goal in a longer term is to procure contracts across the whole unitary authority to potentially harness economies of scale and to unify a service. But what will help you in making that decision is understanding the scope of the contract portfolio and considering whether there are potential efficiencies that can be made to existing contracts and services, as well as looking ahead to that longer term goal. And that would likely require variations to your current contracts and consideration of operational, contractual, procurement risk as well. But it could end up leading to improvements in existing contracts. So that's really where that importance of understanding how you might implement changes really comes in. Subject to the same modification risks, new unitaries might also want to consider varying the length of certain contracts. So you might want to dovetail expiry across different similar contracts, and that would involve varying their length. So if, for example, a new unitary inherits multiple different HWRC contracts, then it might be that you want to vary the terms of those contracts to end at the same time, and allow a reprocurement exercise across the whole authority if that's what you decide is the best thing for your authority. There'll naturally, of course, be several ancillary tasks in the transfer of each contract to the new authorities, and that will range from large scale, more complex tasks like transferring staff and transferring data to minor tasks like updating providers with new contact details. So it might be helpful for authorities to start to pull together lists of what needs to be done and considerations for each contract that can then be worked through individually. Transferring staff, of course, will be a key concern for waste services, given the huge number of employees involved. And where that's an outsourced contract, it will likely be a bit simpler because you won't actually require a TP transfer during LGR, but it will of course be a bit more complex for in-house provision. And so again, it will just be really important to understand the details of those contracts and to look at how that might be split once you know the makeup of your particular LGR. So I'll hand over then to Emma to think about more of the operational considerations.
Yeah. So really, when we think about the operational considerations, when we've got a live contract, so one that's sort of not nearing its end as we go through this LGR process, it's probably something that's kind of quite live for a lot of people on this call, is kind of flipping it through that resident lens, actually, that how do I do this? And I think the top point there, and I'm sure it's on most people's minds, is actually how do I achieve service continuity through this process? Ultimately, if we're thinking collections, residents do care who their new council is. They really care about is their bin picked up. So how does that level of service continuity continue, and what mechanisms do we need to put in place during that process to make sure that happens? Because ultimately that's what the success of any waste service is judged upon. We've done the best planning in the background, but if ultimately the streets aren't swept, the bins aren't collected, the HWRC doesn't open, or there's nowhere to take the waste, that is considered kind of politically, at least from the front, for failure. And we're dealing with new members in a new council kind of as we launch through this process. So that's kind of really front facing there. But actually, what we all know that sits behind all of these, yes, the bins need to be collected, is a number of systems and processes and actually technology integrations. So where one council's website might back into, say, a white space API, because that's what that contractor chooses to use, we may have another part of a council looking into like a Bartek backend KPI. I'm just thinking about kind of on the real technology side, how does that all work together in the future to be able to keep the level of kind of transparency and reporting that we have at the minute? The industry's gone massive way, got a huge way in terms of the level of kind of experience and real-time information and management information that we can gather. How do we keep that and sustain that through this LGR process, but actually still give that resident that way of interacting with the service? I need to report my missed bin. I need to register for assisted collection. I need a clinical, all those things that will continue happening no matter how LGR works, still a service to be delivered. So I think as much as we can think about the kind of people and the vehicles, it's all of that back office stuff as well, and how does that play through, which is going to be absolutely key in terms of how we measure success of those transitions through live contracts, as well as how we reprocure, innovate and things in the background. Next slide. Back to Sharpe.
Thank you. So we won't focus for too long on this one because it's going into kind of legal principles. But as I'm sure everyone who works in councils is aware, local authorities have to abide by public law principles, and obviously that continues to apply during LGR transition. As always, and as kind of underlies any discharge of public function, when making decisions on LGR and transferring functions to the new unitary authorities, local authorities must act in accordance with their due exercise of their powers and the discharge of their functions. And similarly, they must act rationally, as any decision can be challenged if it is found to be so unreasonable that no local authority would have made it. I think those are fairly standard, and you know, those kind of underlie the whole process of local government decision making. But I think the principle of fettering of discretion is slightly more interesting and perhaps more challenging in the context of LGR. So the principle is that public authorities may not adopt policies so rigid that it would limit or control an exercise of discretion. And in relation to LGR, it could be argued that entering into, for example, a really long-term contract might constrain future decision-making abilities of successor authorities. And so we've thought about and listed on the slide, and we've already talked through some of these as well, some of the key mitigations to that and ways for authorities to demonstrate observance of those public law principles. So, for example, during a procurement process, we've discussed that you would want to consider the length of a contract, and it might be that you avoid unnecessarily long commitments, although of course you do have to balance that with other considerations such as value for money, and so that makes it quite a complex, I suppose, balancing act. And we've also mentioned including suitable termination provisions or break clauses to allow for LGR and potential kind of merging of functions or services. But I think really the main point is, where possible, ensuring that there is sufficient flexibility in a contract if you're procuring it, or if you're looking at a live contract, looking at where those areas of flexibility might be. So again, looking at change processes, etc., to really allow for LGR and for any future discretion to be exercised by successor authorities. And that, I think, brings this section to an end.